Hello, welcome to Cultural Academy. Today we want to look at cultural scales to see if we can understand our culture and other cultures better. Right after the intro. You want to become an expert in culture, in understanding cultures. You want to gain intercultural competency. So let's look at cultural scales. How can you learn and compare foreign cultural values with your own values? How can you contrast these values, beliefs, and assumptions of a foreign culture? The cultural scales might be helpful. Let's look and explore what they are. In cross-cultural studies, we talk about the cultural scales. So what are these cultural scales? It's easy. You put your values, your cultural values, or your cultural dimensions, and the cultural values or dimensions of another culture on the scale, and then you compare or you contrast these values with each other. So let me give you a short history of these cultural scales. Edward Hall has written his book Beyond Culture in 1976, where he began to contrast cultural values or cultural dimensions. Well, he was interested in cross-cultural communication, and he studied culture in the aspect of time and space, and he started out to tell us the first time about the low context and the high context. And he began to contrast these values with each other. So there are high context cultures and low context cultures. High context cultures have accumulated a lot of information within them. Low context cultures need to get the information from the outside, from the newspapers or from the internet or from the outside. So they don't store as much information within themselves. He brought us a certain scale where space and time was on a line. For time, he talked about the monochronic and the polychronic understanding of time. So monochronic will be you do one thing at a time, and polychronic, you can do many things at the same time. The same with space. So space is not the same for every culture. So in some culture, people are more distant, and in other cultures, people are more close. Edward Hall was one of the first persons who started out with sort of a cultural scale. Well, we also read from Trompenaars Hampden-Turner in 1996 in Riding the Waves of Culture. They also used quite a few of these contrasting values. Well, they don't give us any scales or continuum in comparison of these cultural dimensions. Peterson in 2004 explains 5 cultural scales in his book. He talks about the scales of equality and hierarchy, of direct and indirect culture, of an individual culture or a group or communitarian culture, of a task-oriented or relationship-oriented culture, and of a risk or a caution culture. A little bit later, in 2005, we look at Hofstede's book, Cultures and Organizations. Although Hofstede doesn't use specifically the scales, he doesn't draw a line, but he also contrasts different cultural dimensions with each other. Hofstede added some other cultural values, and he has a scale of 1 to 100. Hofstede studied hundreds of different countries and nations, specifically for the business world, and looked at their specific culture in order to find out what are the different cultural dimensions. So Hofstede looked at the question of power distance. That's a relationship to authority. Is a small or a large power distance? He looked also at the individual and collective cultures. But then he looked at the gender roles, talking about masculinity and femininity. In ways of dealing with the unknown, he started and looked at uncertainty avoidance. So how can we avoid the uncertainty? How can we avoid ambiguity? There are cultures that are very, very brave. There are cultures that don't care if there's ambiguity, and other cultures are very, very careful. So it has to do with risk taking. He further looked at the orientation of long-term and short-term orientation. That has to do with the time perspective. At last, he was looking at dealing with national drives. So he looked at indulgence and restraint. That has to do with emotions, has to do with our leisure time or work time, has to do with release desires or control desires. So Hofstede did really extensive studies. He collected a lot of data to find out what country would prefer what specific dimension of culture. Last but not least, we find Erin Meyer, who wrote a book that is called The Culture Map. She also used these cultural scales. She has 8 cultural scales. You can see them here on the screen. And so she looked at evaluating, at persuasion, at deciding, at trusting, and disagreeing. So these are some of the dimensions that the others haven't looked at yet. Erin Meyer did a great job in contrasting these cultural dimensions. So you put your cultural dimension on the scale, and you put the cultural dimension of your colleague on the scale, and then you can compare where are you distant and where are you far apart in these cultural values. So how shall we use these cultural scales? You take one of the cultural values of your culture and the host culture. Let's take the example of individualism and collectivity or group thinking. Let's say you are American and you work with a person from Latin America. Hofstede will give you as an American the score of 91 as an individual on the scale of the individualism index. But the Mexican has a score of 30. So he is much more on the collective side than you are. You are totally on the opposite side. Now let's say you have another colleague coming in, and this colleague, for example, is a French person. The score of the French colleague is 71. So what does it tell you now if you have the Mexican colleague, the French colleague, and then your scores? You can compare and you can contrast the numbers with each other. Well, it will tell you that you need to be very careful as an individual to not overlook the people from the collective countries. You need to be very careful also not to judge the behavior of the person of the more collective country. Also, it would mean that the people from a more collective country or group thinking country would need more interaction with you as you ever like. You want to be for yourself a little bit apart, but they are looking for the group, they are looking for the community. You can easily exclude people from a group thinking culture in your communication because you're used to just communicate what's important for you and you don't think about people from the group culture. But not just with your communication, also with your actions and with your work in general. And the others who are from a group thinking country, they need much more exchange than you are willing to think about or willing to give. Therefore, these scales can help us to examine my own and my colleagues' culture. They will help us to understand each other much better. Well, one little word of caution. These scales, they are not 100% pure and precise. So it's a generalization, but it gives us a larger overview of what's going on in a specific country. There might be differences in one country depending on the location or depending on a specific people group, but in general they are correct if it comes to the culture in general. So these scales, they can help us to understand my culture and my colleague who is from a different cultural background. We can contrast our values with the help of these scales to understand each other better and live better together and work better together. In the coming weeks, we will look at several of these cultural values more in detail. So stay tuned on the channel and subscribe down here and come back. And If you have worked with these cultural scales already, you may leave a little comment in the comment section, and we can discuss it, and you can maybe bring us your experience. So thank you very much. It was a short video. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time. Okay, bye.